Welcome to Questions of Our Times. Tonight's question is, the world is broken, what would Jesus do? My guest tonight has written more than 400 hymns and anthems. He's written books on worship and spirituality. He is arguably this generation's most prolific hymn writer. His words and music are sung by congregations and choirs around the world, and his music appears in hymn books of numerous denominations and on many albums. He's a regular contributor on Radio 4's Thought for the Day. He is a broadcaster, an author, and a hymn book editor. A minister of the Church of Scotland and a member of the Iona Community, and a fellow of the Royal School of Church Music. He is a man with the gift of translating eternal truths into everyday language. And so here to talk with me today is the Reverend John Bell. John, good evening and welcome. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks. Good evening.
Let's get straight into our topic, John, because we've got lots of people watching already and they're all keen to hear what you've got to say. And they'll obviously respond in due course. Now, John, as a wordsmith and a musical craftsman, you work with things and create things of immense beauty. How beautiful do you think the world is today?
Well, you know, beauty is really something which is in the eye of the beholder. Where I grew up in Kilmarnock, occasionally my mother would be hanging out the washing, and one of our neighbours would say, "Oh, that's a lovely washing you've got out, Mrs. Bell, very beautiful." Now, I believe that there is plenty of beauty in the world. When you see a grandmother kissing her grandchild, that's a beautiful thing. When you see two old people holding hands, that's a beautiful thing. When you see a lovely table set with a family around it, that's a beautiful thing. And you know, snow falling and the last rose of summer, the first rose of summer, they're beautiful. And that beauty will not go away. There's different kinds of beauty. There's aesthetic beauty, there's moral beauty, there's physical beauty. And that's because God intended the world to be beautiful. He didn't make an ugly world, he made a beautiful world. I think that what we're dealing with at the moment is that with regard to some extent, moral beauty, that's being denigrated by war and by malicious gossip in high places. And we're also seeing the denigration of natural beauty because of the situation which affects the climate and the ecosphere and you know, the whole globe. And when we spend all our time concentrating on that, I think we'll lose sight maybe of the beauty which is always there and was always meant to be there.
Yep.
So beauty hasn't disappeared, but I think that the ugliness of human behavior has eclipsed it in many places.
We will be looking at both aspects then, the beauty that is always there and the ugliness of human behavior. Let's just touch on that second one for the moment. We are currently living in the aftermath of a global pandemic. There is an existential climate threat to the planet. There is a war and there have been threats of nuclear attack in Europe. We have political turbulence at home and an economic crisis also. Can you recall a more challenging time for this country?
Well, not in my lifetime. I mean, I remember in 1962 when there was a Cuba crisis. I remember I was 12 then. I remember on the way home from school going into a park in Kilmarnock to pray that the world might not end up in a nuclear mess. I mean, it was a very terrifying thing. But that was just one solitary incident. I mean, if you think now, there's the Brazilian rainforest, which is in a mess. There's internal disquiet within Iran. There's an ongoing friction over the land rights for Palestinians. There is a country, Pakistan, which has known floods, and you've got Somalia, which has known drought. And the truth and lies debacle in the United States and the war in Ukraine. So there are a whole lot of things which are actually on the go just now. And I think that what makes it more difficult for us is that compared, say, to 1962, the channels of information then were very few. You had, you know, a daily newspaper, and then you had BBC One and ITV, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And these were, you know, the newspapers by and large and the television channels gave a kind of balanced understanding the news. But now we're in a world where information can come to you via a mobile phone from somebody in a region of the world where you might know that person, and where the information that comes to you is very conflicting and very annoying. And if people are bombarded so often by messages of how bad the world is, then I think that leads to incredible confusion. And, you know, we just don't know, and think there's no end of it.
Yeah.
And that for me is what makes this present dilemma the dilemma that it is. We know that so many things are going wrong, and we know so few things going right.
Yeah. I sense you're almost hinting there that sort of the availability of news, be it real news, genuine news, or fake news, through the likes of social media and 24/7 rolling news channels and stream, you know, all the ways we get information these days. Is this a help, or is it a hindrance? Is it making us aware so that we can do something about it, or is it making us aware and making us feel that we can't do anything about it?
Well, I think it depends to some extent what age you are. You know, I was in a bus going up to Oban 4 weeks ago. Behind me were two young people from the Netherlands, where I used to work. So I got talking with them. They were about 23, 24. And when I come off the bus, I said, now, if you're in Britain and you want to catch up with world news, then here's the name of two newspapers you might go for. You might go for the Times or the Guardian. They've both got good international news. And these two kids said, I know, don't need newspapers any longer. Yeah. And I said, why not? They said, it's just bad news. Yeah. And I've spoken to a graduate, you know, a PhD student from Cambridge, asked him the same question. Doesn't listen to the news. He gets a news feed, which will deliver you, either for good or bad, what you want to hear. And I mean, there's no way around it. That's the world in which we are. But I think it's a very confusing world, particularly if you're a young person and you're trying to feel positive about a world where the messages that flood in are fairly negative messages.
You use the word there, confusing. Our topic tonight has the premise that the world is broken. Given that all you've said, and you've compared it to the relatively short-lived, but it was actually a very tense time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, it was so tense, wasn't it, back then, that the government actually issued bulletins about what you should do in the case of a nuclear attack. Should you nip under your kitchen table? You know, you got 4 minutes to do so. Still got a kitchen table. You know, is the world broken, John? You know, we hear, yes, you rightly so say that, you know, people are confused and they're very selective about what information they receive. Is the world broken?
Well, I think that the world has brokenness in it. I think that'd be a better thing to say. I mean, it's not that the whole world is collapsing. I mean, the world is, you know, if somebody has a heart attack, one of the nice things that's sometimes said to them is, you know, your heart's very resilient. It's beating all the time. And okay, damage might be done, but it can repair. And I think the world's like that. The world is an incredibly interesting organism, which always has had flaws in it. You know, when God made the world, God did not make a perfect world. God made a good world. The notion that we should have a kind of Eden here is not for us. We've got, you know, if you live in California, you have the San Antonio Fault. You know, that's a possibility for an earthquake. If you live in Hawaii, in the Big Island, there's a volcano that might erupt. Now, that's not indicative of a broken world. It's indicative of a world which has flaws in it, which sometimes erupt, and there's no other world. What we're dealing with, I think, more is the brokenness of a covenant between humanity and the earth. You know, God makes a covenant with Noah about how God, after the flood, will never again destroy that which God has made. And he makes it not just with human beings, he makes it with the smallest daisy and the wee dormouse, and the whole of creation has this covenant. God never breaks that covenant, but we are in a situation now where we have the possibility of doing that which God would never do again, and that is to inflict a brokenness in the world which the world can't sustain. You see, the world has a natural ability to replenish itself. You know, if there's an earthquake, it can heal. If you go to Australia, you find that certain trees, in order to seed, burst into flame, and the seeds go into the ground.
Yep.
But and so the world has an inbuilt mechanism whereby it can replenish itself. But if we ask too much of the world, and if we destroy too much of the world's health, then that's a brokenness which we are inflicting, which was not there in the beginning and was never meant to be, and for which we have to own responsibility.
Again, I kind of can readily relate that to sort of the climate and the environment situation that we face ourselves at the moment. Would the concept of broken covenant with God, was that summarized why the world financially, economically, in terms of conflicts, is that why the world is in the state it's in? It's because humankind has broken a relationship with God?
Well, one would have to say both yes and no. You know, I'm quite interested in parts of the Hebrew scriptures that are not often read. There's bits of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah. I mean, Isaiah's got this great image about how the sins of the earth's people, the sins of the people weigh heavily on the earth. It staggers like a drunk man, falls unable to rise again, or what's that effect? Yeah. And there's 2 or 3 times when clearly there is an inbuilt decision of God that if we do not treat the world fairly, the world will not treat us fairly. I think that's part of that's part of the deal.
Will reap what we've sown.
Now, when it comes to wars and malevolence against people and that kind of human thing, I think that's just indicative to some extent that within human beings there has always been the capacity in the face of good to decide to do what's wrong. And I think that comes in 2 forms. Sometimes we could look at say Russia just now and say, well, there you are, Putin. He's a terrible man. He's a wicked man, and he's inflicting horrendous might and destruction on Ukraine. Yeah, but who put him there? How many people voted for him? And which of the people in the nations which are opposed to him ever thought, how do we deal with this guy if he gets out of hand? And you can look at the same Bolsonaro, you know, you say, well, that's a wicked man. That's a man whose sin and iniquity has led to the destruction of big parts of the rainforest and the inhabitants there. Yeah, but who voted him in? Half the Brazilian population. And who benefits from the Brazilian rainforest being taken down? People who have financial interests in, among other things, rearing cattle. So you get rid of the trees and you bring in cattle to feed the American appetite for beef. I mean, you can go through to apartheid in South Africa. I mean, you can blame Hendrik Verwoerd for bringing it in from theology, you know, the theology of the Dutch Reformed Church into political reality. Yeah, but who kept it going? The white population kept it going, and Britain was unwilling to stand against it. So there's a kind of iniquity which comes sometimes from narcissistic and populist leaders and people of financial substance who think that they can call the shots. And if they're persuasive enough, then bad things get done to a good world and to good people. But you also, I think, in particular now at the moment, within the Western world, we have got a kind of sense of entitlement, which you don't find in the Southern Hemisphere, that we should have an abundance of things which we want, which we believe that we need, and if we can't get them, then we complain. And that I think is an iniquity which is damaging to the world. We want to have fresh fruit all the time, so we get it imported on planes. We eat unseasonally. We expect countries in other parts of the world to make our clothes cheaply so that we can. I mean, that is really quite an iniquitous thing, and we're all into it. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was last week talking and discovered really than talking about was that around about the 1972, the average household would spend about 25% of its income on food.
Mhm.
And now the average household spends 10% of its income on food. And that's despite, food has got comparatively cheaper. But why this shift? Well, it's because we have so many luxury goods and so many possessions and so many cars, and they all need servicing and insurance and repair and energy to make them work, that we can't afford to feed ourselves.
Yeah.
Now that's just, that's a failure in the human soul to recognise what's important.
Yeah.
And I think, and when it gets to a level where that inflicts punishment on other people, it's iniquitous.
And we all bear some culpability in the West.
We all bear some culpability in the West. The 10% of the wealthiest people in the world who mostly inhabit the West are responsible for 90% of the world's pollution.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems a kind of
and we gather at COP this week, and we want to try and lecture the developing world not to use the fossil fuels, despite the fact that we use them for 100 years.
That's right. And Bangladesh has put nothing up into the air, and yet it's a country which is suffering environmentally. Or you could take almost any African nation, the same kind of thing. They have little which affects the atmosphere. There might be pollutants on the land which affect the land, but they've been sold by international petrochemical industries from in America. Yeah. Why must the poor suffer? And why do we who are wealthier feel as if, well, we should always be maintaining our standard of living and that we should always go for endless growth? Growth.
Yeah, well, that's unlikely to happen in the near future. Questions are coming in on this topic. I'm delighted to say, folks, if you've got some more, please just keep them coming in. It's great. We must move on because we've got to look at the other part of the question tonight. The second part of the question is, what would Jesus do? Now, before we look at that, the world is broken, what would Jesus do? Let's consider the person of Jesus. Is Jesus to you, John, or why is Jesus to you, John, more than a Santa Claus or a tooth fairy or an imaginary friend?
Well, I could say that nobody so far has spent after life doing research and PhDs on Santa Claus or the tooth fairy, but that would be kind of to evade the issue. I think
it's only a matter of time.
for me, there are two things. The one is that the documentation about Jesus is very convincing. We've got 4 Gospels, and they're not all the same. Matthew has an interest in the teaching of Jesus primarily. Mark looks at sometimes 3 miracles per chapter. Luke shows Jesus favouring of telling stories, the big stories, and of favouring women and people who are disadvantaged. And John, which is the latest gospel, has a more kind of reflective and spiritual and theological understanding of Jesus' life. Now, if you wanted to concoct the Saviour of the world, I don't think you'd give the kind of detail that was in the Gospels. I mean, I don't know any religious leader of any tradition who would allow himself to be known as someone who enjoyed the company of prostitutes. And yet this is clear in Jesus. Nor do I think many people who have been leaders in the world would break down and cry in front of other people at a funeral. And you'd probably want to avoid, if this was the Son of God in humanity, you'd probably want to avoid any notion they might be controversial. You'd want somebody who is much more kind of, responsible, decent, upright, and the fact that we have all this information about Jesus, which kind of goes against the grain of his emotional life, of the kind of company he keeps, of how he risks being discredited in order that people who are ill might be cured and people who are marginalized might be included. It's the earthiness of the gospel which makes me convinced that Jesus was a live human being. I mean, there's also books outside the gospels that bear witness to the fact that he lived on earth. But the other thing is that there's an authenticity of Jesus such that 2,000 years after his life, people who hear of him and who attend to his words find in them something that can be found nowhere else. This is the truth, and this is light, and this is life. And across the centuries, irrespective of where people are and what language they speak or what tradition they come from, people are still touched by the authenticity of these words, which could not have come from a machine or by human design, but they've come from God.
Now, you talk there about there being an historical Jesus, that there are the 4 Gospels, there are other external texts that actually attest to the fact that there really was a Jesus. Many people are very, very happy, and including, I've heard Richard Dawkins say it from his own lips, that he's quite happy to accept an historical Jesus. But there's a difference between an historical Jesus, isn't there, and claiming that this man was actually divine, the Son of God, the Messiah. What convinces you that that's who Jesus is?
Well, it's partly that in his time, the people who thought they knew what the Messiah should be like were very disappointed. That there was a distinction in Jesus, which was totally contrary to what the religion of his day envisaged a Messiah to be. But rather he comes as one who is rooted in the scriptures of the Old Testament, which have glimmers of the kind of person who is to come. And he fulfills that, while what the Pharisees particularly and the priests expect is someone who is much more kind of decent and responsible and law-abiding. And, you know, if you look at Jesus in the context of what was envisaged in the Psalms and in the prophets particularly, a figure who is a disappointment, who people will condemn, who people might try to punish, and yet a person who has come in order that not just the Jews, but that the whole world might be brought to God. This is so different from what the religion of his day wanted. And I also, you know, because I believe that what Jesus says about humanity is true, and what the teaching that Jesus gives regarding how we should live, I take that to be so incontrovertibly true that when Jesus begins to talk about heaven or eternity or his self-identity, I would not doubt him, because everything else that he says has rung true, and he's not a figure who would deceive us.
Now, you talk about perceptions there, and you have used the word controversial. You have suggested there that some of the religious groups, of contemporary religious groups, were looking for somebody who was decent and law-abiding. If we look at, say, some of the Victorian hymn writers, many of us grew up singing Victorian hymns, although of course we weren't living in the Victorian age. And you're a hymn, obviously a well-known and well-loved hymn writer yourself. If we believe the hymn writers of 100 years ago and their perception of Jesus, it comes like something like the little Lord Jesus. And we'll be singing this in a couple of weeks' time, all of us. The little Lord Jesus, no crying he made. We know the hymn that has the line, he was gentle child of gentle mother. And of course, the little childhood hymn that we all grew up with, or many of us grew up with, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Now, what do you think Jesus was like? I mean, what was he? I mean, you know, surely he must have cried. No, crying he makes is crazy, sentimental.
Yeah, I mean, hymns very often speak of their time and they become obsolete. And these kind of hymns that you mentioned were written not really in celebration of Jesus, but because, well, maybe a couple of things. One was that there was high infant mortality, and there were hymns written for children, which gave the impression that Jesus was wanting them to come to heaven, and that was a solace to children. A whole lot of these songs.
There's a friend for little children.
Yeah, above a bright blue sky, that kind of thing. The gentle, meek, and mild thing, I just can't stand, because it's so unbiblical. I mean, gentle, fair enough. We can see that there are moments in Jesus' life when he's in, I think sensitive's a better word than gentle, but when the way in which he treats people is with incredible kindness and sensitivity. But meek, now, you know, if somebody were to say to me, oh, I met this person down the street, they're quite meek, I think, oh, well, you know, because now it means ineffectual. But when the King James version was put together, meek meant humble, and we can see humility in Jesus. As for mild, well, you have to ask, did the Pharisees think he was mild? You know, when he called them a bunch of snakes and when he excoriated them for them and the lawyers heaping burdens on people who couldn't carry them. And did the disciples think that Jesus was mild when he was, the word's indignant in some translations of the Bible, because they tried to keep women and children away from Jesus? And did Peter think that Jesus was mild when he said, "Get behind me, Satan"? And did Herod think Jesus was mild when he called him a fox? And did the rich official who invited him for a meal, the rich Pharisee invite him for a meal, did he think that he was being decent and kind and gentle and nice when he accused him of being totally inhospitable? And yet there's a woman washing his feet with her tears, who he says shows love. I mean, this is somebody who is able to be in command of a whole repertoire of emotional responses, levels of conversation, and vocabulary suited to the event. And this is part of the amazing sensitivity of Jesus. I think maybe if we just get rid of somebody gentle, meek, and mild, can't stand it. Gregarious, conversational, controversial, dynamic, sensitive. But there is a convenience sometimes in making Jesus out to be this kind of soft touch, a bit of a kind of wimp, because he poses then no problems to those who hold power in the institutions of religion. But he also, when he's portrayed as such, he demands little of people who are asked to follow him. And ultimately, that's what we want people to do. That's what Jesus wants people to do. We want them to, I would follow somebody who was gentle, meek, and mild. I would find that the most boring thing in the world. But I will follow somebody who might upset me by what he says, and who will put perspectives on life which are beyond my initial understanding, who shows kindness to people who don't deserve it, who has an amazing capacity to include people and to forgive. That's the kind of person I would follow. Yeah. But Jesus, gentle, meek, and mild.
No way.
Sorry.
No, John, no, please don't apologize. Okay, so we know Jesus is known as a moral teacher. People will readily accept that he was special in his teaching, and that he actually maybe even worked a miracle or two. He was a miracle worker. The Gospels record that when people encountered Jesus, he changed their lives. So let's come to the actual topic of tonight, the key question. The world is broken. We've established that, or it's confused, or it's not as it should be. There is brokenness in the world. The world is broken. What would Jesus do about the world today?
Well, it's difficult. You can only speculate.
Yeah.
I mean, the Jews of his day did not expect God to turn up in the way in which God did. Yeah. And so, I think we have to be very cautious about thinking what Jesus would do if he were to return. I think for my own response would be, in terms of the world is broken, how would Jesus fix it? I don't think he would fix it. Yeah. Jesus in the Gospels does not want to be seen as a Mr. Fix-It. He heals a man at the pool who's crippled, but there's a lot of people who he doesn't heal. He feeds 5,000 people, he doesn't feed 1 billion. He encourages some people to follow him, but he also loves those who are not of his faith. And he challenges people of power, but not every leading priest or politician. And it seems to me that in Jesus' short ministry, which is 3 years, he doesn't come as the answer to problems as much as showing people the way in which to deal with the joy, the potential, and the brokenness in the world. And he expects people to follow his way. It is those who are made in God's image, and those to whom God has entrusted the care of the planet, and those whom Jesus has called to love even though they are unlovely, it's these people and their resources who Jesus would call on to do the fixing. I don't believe that he would come in glory and say, look at this mess, I'll sort it right out. I just don't think.
So it's almost like, and there's a line in the hymn somewhere, that he has no hands but our hands. It's you know,
yes,
it almost expects some sort of partnership between those who are his followers and himself, or it expects his followers to be engaged in the world to help solve the world's problems.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, if he were to appear on Earth, I don't think he would ask if he could get a kind of stage at the United Nations. I think he'd probably sit among people who were displaced and who were flung out of their country, and from there offer some kind of critique on the oppressors. And I don't think he'd particularly, you know, ask for an interview with the IMF or the World Bank.
Yeah.
But he might sit among people who were totally impoverished,
yeah.
and encourage them to believe in their worth, and to persuade them that they have a potential for good which can change things. You know, the notion of Jesus taking the center stage doesn't seem to me to be the way in which he worked in the past. He comes almost from a periphery, you know, born in a stable, a refugee in Egypt, somebody for whom the first attempt in his life happens in his home synagogue. I mean, this is not a venture capitalist. This is not a Mr. Big. This is not a supremo. The way in which God works is an entirely different way, and it involves a partnership between the people made in God's image and the purpose of God to which they're enjoined.
Now, John, you speak there about you would see Jesus sitting down with those who are the have-nots rather than the haves. One of the accusations often leveled at Christianity is that it's all about pie in the sky when you die. But this winter in the UK and other parts of the world, many people will be going without pie on their dinner tables because of the cost of living crisis. How relevant is Jesus to them, do you think?
Well, I think we have to be very careful that we don't get into a kind of binary situation where there's the wealthy and the successful and the poor and they are unsuccessful, because, you know, we shouldn't patronize the poor. Jesus saw in impoverished people generosity which rich people didn't have. And he points the rich Pharisees who are flashing their checkbooks at each other, showing how generous they are to the temple funds. He points them to this poor widow as the model for how they should give. And when it comes to faith, he never points to people who are pedigreed in faith. He sees in a hemorrhaging woman whom no man would touch or allow to touch him, and in a Samaritan leper, the only one who comes back to say thank you, and in a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter is ill. In these outsiders, Jesus sees faith. So there's something about how, for the world to be healed, it's not, there is a potential within those at the bottom for enabling that healing to happen. But the further away we are from them, among whom Jesus sat, and who served him, the further we are away from them, I think we absent ourselves from the source of our healing. But I do believe, and I've seen this, you know, in Paraguay and in Nepal and in other places, the people who have nothing often have an enviable faith. And that the gospel says to them that the Son of God, the highest of the high, in the incarnation entered into solidarity and shared both the grief and the joy of those who are at the bottom. He exists in solidarity with them. And that, for people at the bottom, is a great solace, that they are not forgotten by God, even if they might be forgotten by people made in God's image who are wealthier.
We've covered a lot of areas this evening in our short time. One of the things that upsets or worries a lot of people is the concept that somehow what is visited upon the planet is some sort of form of divine retribution. I think back to the 1980s when the world became aware of AIDS, and that was tagged the gay plague, and it was seen as some sort of good judgment by God. Back in when COVID first came to light a few years ago now, there was obviously a lot of ignorance about it, but some websites were ablaze. We talk of it being God's judgment. To what extent are pandemics and things that hit the world God judging us?
Well, is it God judging us, or is it us just making a mess of things? I mean, I think that I'm trying to find like a biblical parallel. But Jesus is very cautious about ascribing illness to sin. It's very interesting. I was doing a conference recently on the miracles, and I said to the people, how many of these miracles involve Jesus forgiving someone before they're cured? And most folk thought between 5 and 10. There's actually one miracle where forgiveness happens. And when the disciples first and the Pharisees later, in confronting the man born blind, say, who sinned, him or his parents? Jesus won't have that. And when there's a tower in Siloam which has collapsed and killed people, Jesus says, it's not that these people were bad. So, there are things like virulent diseases which we cannot control. And they come upon us, and they've always come upon humanity. I mean, you go back 100 years and you had plagues and, diphtheria and a whole lot of other things that killed people. The flu killed a lot of people off, the Black Plague. And I think that these are part of the fault lines which are in the world, which we have to deal with. I think the iniquitous thing comes when it's I think God kind of forgives our ignorance if we don't know that doing this will cause harm to other people. I think that God's compassionate and kind of forgive our ignorance. But when we willfully decide to amass weapons of mass destruction, and when we willfully finance schemes which denigrate people elsewhere, then when bad things happen to us, I think that is part of the judgment of God.
Yeah. We have reaped what we have sown.
We reap what we sow.
Yeah. John, this is fantastic. We have got lots of questions from our audience. So I'd like us now, if we may, just to take some of those. And we've got 20 minutes or so left. So if you're ready, I cannot guarantee what they're going to ask, but here we go. Okay, says this audience member tonight, you say Jesus wasn't meek, but yet he famously said that the meek shall inherit the earth. So how do you square that? How do you explain that?
Well, I could say he was quoting Jeremiah. That'd be very smart.
Yes.
But I would have to say this comes from the authorized version.
Yeah.
And words change meaning.
Yeah.
And meek meant humble in the 16th century.
Yeah.
And today, meek for most people means ineffectual.
Yeah.
So my argument is not with the scripture, but my argument is with the way in which words have changed meaning.
Yeah.
And sometimes, because in the church we have a legacy. I mean, I was brought up in the King James Bible. Because we have a legacy of holding on to these precious statements, we forget that they might not mean the same to people today as they meant to us who are schooled in that particular vocabulary.
Excellent. Okay, now here's another question about Jesus. Obviously, our topic tonight has been, what would Jesus do? And the questioner says, surely we should not be asking what would Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing? Surely he hasn't abandoned us.
No, not at all. No. But
do you see Jesus as being an interventionist? That suddenly he's going to come in and he can feed the world? No, but
I don't see Jesus as being an interventionist, but I do see Jesus as one who, through the Holy Spirit, inspires people to do that which he would have done were he on earth. And I think that, and just a maybe a kind of gauche thing to say, but I think that in Britain, we suffer from a limited understanding of the teaching of Jesus. That we have a great many, paintings and songs to deal with his birth. We've got many which deal with his resurrection and his suffering beforehand, but we don't have much about the 3 years in between. It's like the Apostles' Creed, born of the Virgin Mary, comma, suffered under Pontius Pilate. That's a big fat comma.
Yeah.
That is 33 years of life, of which 3 are years of ministry.
Yeah.
And and this is not a judgment on people, but sometimes it seems to me that people think, well, we have to understand all the doctrines of the Christian faith, and we have to get into St. Paul as if Paul was the Messiah and Jesus was the warm-up act.
Yeah.
Now, it might seem outrageous to say, I don't think Paul knew much about Jesus. He never quotes from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew. He never mentions a miracle of Jesus, Mark. He never relates to a story of Jesus or Jesus' fondness for women, Luke. And he doesn't have any of the I am sayings in John. Because Paul he's an apologist to the Jews, trying to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. He's an evangelist to the Gentiles, saying that God is there for them. He is trying to get churches into some kind of decent order in different cultures. He never, apart from his one experience on the Damascus Road, had the kind of knowledge of Jesus that the disciples had. And that's why he felt a bit of an outsider in the circle of the apostles. Mm. And so, there's a great deal of teaching about how do we understand salvation, how do we understand the whole range of things that end with ION.
Yes.
But sometimes at the cost of looking at exactly what Jesus did and exactly what Jesus said and asking how Jesus can be in me and in my words and in my deeds. And that doesn't come from sophisticated theology. It comes from having within us the gospel and the words of Christ as our guidance. And then through us, Jesus continues his work of reconciliation and healing and salvation.
What do you think Jesus meant when he prayed that God's kingdom might come on earth as in heaven? And have we focused too much on heaven being a place that we go to after death?
Yeah, it's not so much as a Victorian era, which you're very fond of. The Victorians are very keen in heaven. Great pictures of it, because people, as distinct from now, when people might expect to live until they're 80. In the Victorian era, right up to my grandfather, he died in 1960, I think, and he died at the age of 67. Most men, and where I came from, retired at 65 and died a year or two later. And so that, when you're aware of the shortness of life, then heaven becomes something you want to think about. And I think our notions of heaven were given a battering when Yuri Gagarin went up above the bright blue sky and didn't see Jesus in a throne.
Yeah. And
so we've kind of lost, for my money, we've lost an understanding of heaven, and we're stuck sometimes with outdated images. And I think there are plenty of good images. But to your question, when Jesus asked that God's kingdom might come, the kingdom which God wishes to establish has already been prefaced by the prophets. The kingdom which God has established has been made clear in Jesus, in the acts of reconciliation and healing and the challenging of authority and the way in which people are encouraged to love the unlovely and the unlikable, all that kind of stuff. So when he's asking us to pray that God's kingdom should come on earth, he's asking that all that was in him, clearly shown, might still be shown all through the earth. That's a big challenge because it's a big earth.
Yeah. let's just change tack slightly. People are asking about climate change and social issues here, and how Jesus might respond. But also, here's a question here: what do you think ordinary people should do about climate change? Should we stop using plastic, glue ourselves to motorways, commit acts of civil disobedience? How far should we go?
I'm just thinking, I might have a friend of mine, well, I wouldn't say a friend of mine, I'd seen this man for 20 years, devout evangelical Christian, and a man of intellectual sophistication, who has become so irate about the lack of movement with regard to how the country responds to the climate crisis, that he's become part of Extinction Rebellion. I would never have thought it of him at all. So I believe that we were called out to do things which are appropriate to us and which might stretch us a bit. I don't think that we're all called to go necessarily on picket lines. That just wouldn't. Some people, it would be a mess. They would just start crying. So you're better not to do that if that's the way that your mind's made up. Yeah. But I think that we all have decisions to make. How can we decide that we will not presume that the accumulation of things that we don't need is the way that helps the earth? Yeah. And we accumulate stuff that we don't need. We buy new things when we don't need to, when the old ones will last longer. And if people have got investments, then I don't have any investments, but if I had investments, I might question whether these investments are in the right things, or whether I might put them into something which is more kind of friendly. Personally, I had to make a decision the other day. My colleagues and I have supported for a long time an independent church in Nepal, and particularly the evangelist of that church, who we met in England years ago. And they've managed, the growth of the Christian church in Nepal is really astounding in a Hindu country. And Christians were persecuted. When I was last there, new Christians were being persecuted. And so they've this friend of mine, and the church he belongs to has built a new building. And they asked if I'd go through for the opening of it. Well, it was inconvenient because it was October, but I thought, I'll go. I've got time next year. I'll go, and I'll go in March, and I'll not go for too long to Nepal because it's a landlocked country. They don't have much water, and tourists tend to want to have 2 showers a day when it's very hot. But I'll go to Singapore first. And then I thought, next year I'm already booked to go to America and Canada, and that'll involve transatlantic transport. I'm not booked to do anything in Nepal. The church in Nepal will thrive whether I'm there or not. So I'll cancel that trip. Now, I deeply regret that, because I was actually looking forward to it. But in the light of what we've learned, particularly over the last couple of weeks, and what's been discussed, what was discussed at COP27 and COP26 in Glasgow, I have to make decisions about my lifestyle. Yeah. And it's very interesting to see how people are doing. I mean, for me, this is a great thing that people are doing. I was up in Orkney, the last place where you'd imagine that there's a host of electric cars on the go. Because Orkney bought a whole lot of cars and then sold them to, or hired them out to people, and people were very keen. And they've got, places in Orkney where you can, recharge the batteries or whatever. I don't drive at all. I really know how to fill a car with petrol, never mind charge with electricity.
Don't fill an electric one with petrol.
But I think it's great that there are these initiatives which are being taken. Yeah. And the more imaginative we become, and the more we just allow ourselves to feel, how in my household, how in my relationships, how in the food that I buy can I make a difference? I mean, there's endless possibility.
And you touched there actually on our next question, which asks, many young people in particular are fearful and depressed about the future because of the current because of the current environmental crisis. What hope can you offer them? What action can you call them to? Well, I think you've touched on the action. We all have a responsibility to do something. What hope can you offer them?
David and Goliath. See, that when I began my ministry, I was involved in youth work, and I shared my job and my salary with 2 other people. And every Monday we would meet and do a Bible study, because I wanted to root our work in Scripture. So every Monday, for maybe the first 6 months or so, we would take a story from the Bible about young people and look at it. And David and Goliath was very significant. I mean, we kind of see it as a brave boy who gets rid of Goliath, but one of the pivotal points in that is when David comes into the tent of King Saul, and Saul has met him before because, you know, David has played his guitar or his harp when Saul was having a bad turn. And Saul sees this young kind of strapling of a boy and decides that, okay, if he's offering to deal with a Goliath, he'll need some armory. So he puts on helmet, he puts on his breastplate, his tunic, gives him his sword, and then David stumbles and he takes all these things off. This is the equipment which was already failing the Israelite army, and yet they're putting it on a boy. And he does something which is totally contrary to expectation, something much more simpler in order to deal with this enemy. Now, you know, as an adult, aged about to be 73, I regret the legacy that my generation has given to those who are teenagers today. And I don't think that we have all the answers. I think we have to allow for the possibility that those who are younger than us, if given the chance, might, like Greta Thunberg, be able to pinpoint things which have to happen, and that God will use them, whether they're Christians or not, that God will use the potential in young people not to follow the disastrous way in which their forebears have treated the earth in order to secure its future. And I think it's for people like me to give both my encouragement and to say, God bless you.
Yeah. Do you think, here's the next question, do you think Christians have focused too much, and perhaps Christian preachers, too much on individual sins and not on corporate sin? And what might Jesus have to say to the likes of Shell and other major oil companies and world polluters?
Well, to say that the church is fixed on personal sin, I think that the churches are fixed on certain kinds of personal sin.
Yeah.
You know, that if you think of how about, I reckon, maybe about 46 of the Psalms inveigh against malicious gossip. It's one of the 10 Commandments. You know, don't bear false witness. Jesus talks about the tongue being, you know, like something that can light a forest fire. In Revelation, it's liars who are about to be thrown into the sulphurous lake. I don't know any churches that have published reports and had long discussions about the sin of malicious gossip. Usually it comes round to the ethics of sex.
Yeah.
And I think personal responsibility and personal sin has you know, there's a whole range of things. Financial mispropriety, that's another thing. So there is that. I think I'd want to widen the risk of the range of kind of sins that we talk about personally, but also the corporate thing. I think that we tend to see, well, Jesus doesn't really talk about that very much. And that to some extent would be true, although he does, you know, he takes it out on bankers, on lawyers, on Pharisees, which are these are kind of institutions. But he also comes to fulfill, in his words, what is said in the law and the prophets. So if you go to the law and the prophets, you see there how particularly Isaiah and Jeremiah inveigh against the impoverishment, the maltreatment, the persecution of people who are vulnerable and helpless. And Jesus endorses that. You know, he puts his stamp on it. I have come to fulfill that. That is part of the deal. He never contradicts that. He contradicts some of the petty legislation you find in the law books and, you know, Deuteronomy and places like that. But when it comes to the prophets, he's foursquare on them. And if we read the prophets, then we would see that there are powers, some of which are pretty dark, who manipulate the truth, who persecute innocent people, and who cause poverty in places which should know comfort and wealth. Yeah.
Our last question for tonight, and John, and you've got 60 seconds. Hasn't the world always been broken?
Yes, in different ways, in different times. The prophets saw it, Jesus saw it, we're seeing it. It's a given. It's part of what God has given us. And as human beings, we always have to learn and relearn how to deal with whatever brokenness confronts us.
And 30 seconds, where lies the hope for a broken world?
Well, the hope lies in our potential to turn from evil and to do good. It lies in the dreams of the young, and it lies in the heart of God. And the closer we get to the heart of God, the more our hope will increase.
And on that happy note, John Bell, thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and a blessing.
My guest today has been the Reverend John Bell. If you would like to watch this episode again or other conversations from the Questions of Our Time series, please click on the link that appears now in the chat section. Questions of Our Times will return next year for a new series, and we hope to see you then. Meanwhile, thank you for watching and goodbye.